Welcome back to Happiness in Progress. I'm your host, Danielle Craig. I'm an Emmy Award winner, former journalist, mom, wife, and just a person looking for more joy in the everyday. On this podcast, you'll hear stories of inspiration, overcoming, and perspective that will help you become the best version of you. This podcast is brought to you by the Mail Tribune. Check out mailtribune.com for more podcasts. And don't forget, if you like listening, make sure you subscribe so you will never miss an episode. Okay, I need to tell you a true story. I sat down to record this episode 4 days ago, and as I was recording this episode, I literally said out loud, "This is not perfect." And I stopped recording and I walked out of my studio. And do you want to know why that's so hilarious, maybe / not hilarious? Is because this is an episode about perfection. A couple episodes ago, I talked about progress, that movement forward, even when we feel like we're not actually getting anywhere. And today, I really wanted to talk about perfection and what hinders our progress. Perfectionism is a huge culprit. I mean, just 4 days ago, and I have never done this before, which is what was so interesting that I just threw in the towel over an episode that was not perfect. So perfectionism really keeps us from becoming the best version of ourselves because we cannot move forward if we're too worried about everything being perfect. I was recently talking to one of my cousins who told me this incredible story, this perfect story, to represent how perfectionism can really wreak havoc on our progression. Her friend moved into a new house and had all this space to plant a garden. She knew she needed to do some weeding, get the space ready for this perfect garden. It was a huge amount of space and it was going to take a lot of time, but that's okay because she was up to the task. She was really excited about this garden. Every day she went out, she started picking the weeds. After a lot of time, she'd stop. She'd return the next day to another section, the next day to do another section. By the time she had finished weeding this entire plot of land, she looked back to the first spot she weeded. And what do you think happened? If you've ever done any weeding, you know the weeds were already growing back. She had to start again. She went back to the first plot of garden and started weeding. The process was never ending. She could not get anywhere because weeds grow back. Her garden would never be ready for flowers. She was so frustrated. Can you imagine? Finally, her husband said, "Just start planting." Instead of working on the weeds that were always there, she started planting. That plot of land turned from a patch of dirt with weeds to a beautiful garden. And yes, there are still weeds in the garden, but she deals with them as she takes care of the flowers and the different things she's planted. We cannot create or give life to something new if we are waiting for the ground to be perfect. If there is something in your life holding you back, like a whole bunch of never-ending weeds, it is time to plant amid them. Weeds will not be what hinders your worth and your growth. Above keeping you from progressing, dealing with this constant need to be perfect with our minds, bodies, families, careers, it causes a lot of anxiety, depression, even suicidal thoughts, and other mental health problems. I read a study out of Alaska. Researchers found of the people who had died by suicide over a 3-year period in the early 2000s, more than half of them were described to be perfectionists. And part of being a perfectionist is not only someone who wants to do something perfect, but who beats themselves up as a bad person when things aren't perfect. So if we go back to the woman in the garden, it wouldn't have just been that she was unable to do work because of the weeds, but she would also be taking it on as a character flaw that she could not get all those weeds out in time. And as you can imagine, that's a really toxic way to see yourself and your life. On top of these mental consequences of perfectionism, there are also physical consequences. There's research that points to both higher blood pressure in those who are perfectionists and a higher chance of heart disease. And more people than ever are now perfectionists. Research published by the American Psychological Association last year showed young people today are way more worried about being perfect than people in the 80s. Yes, I know you could insert a joke about clothes or hairstyles or something, but I'm going to move forward past that. The researchers looked at data from more than 41,000 college students from America, Britain, and Canada. They were looking at the 3 types of perfectionism. So there's self-oriented, which is basically just the irrational desire to be perfect. Second, socially prescribed. This is when you perceive excessive expectations from others. And third, other-oriented, when you place unrealistic standards on others. The most recent college grads had higher scores for every single form of perfectionism, but the highest was socially prescribed, which increased 33% between 1989 and 2016. Of course, I'm sure most of us can guess why this is happening. We're all probably thinking of social media. That's what the researchers thought too, and I am going to link the research in show notes if you want to take a closer look. They say young people are more dissatisfied with the way they look. They also say they're feeling a huge amount of pressure to earn money, get a good education, have huge career goals. The researchers say this all goes back to comparisons. In the news release from the APA, one researcher is quoted saying, quote, "Today's young people are competing with each other in order to meet societal pressures to succeed, and they feel that perfectionism is necessary in order to feel safe, socially connected, and of worth." They believe they need to be perfect to be safe, socially connected, and worthy. I do have a couple of episodes on comparison and self-worth. I will link all of that. Okay, so the big question, and I don't want to leave you before answering this, is how can we stop being such a perfectionist? 1, we need to be aware that perfectionism is not working for us. Ask yourself, how is perfectionism holding me back? Working in news, there's a saying, you're only as good as your last newscast. This is a pretty terrible way to look at life because none of us are perfect. When I started anchoring TV news, I decided I would count how many times I made a mistake on a word or inflection or sounded kind of dumb. I would then go to my calendar after the newscast and write a number, the number of times I messed up. I would try to beat it the next day. This would be a fine way to improve. I really do believe that, except the language in my head that came with it. I decided I would only be a good TV news anchor if I could get 0 mistakes for a week. Have any of you made 0 mistakes for a full week? When I ask this question at events, everyone starts talking. There's rumbling of noise throughout the room because no, none of us have made 0 mistakes for a full week. Like eating something we had planned not to, sleeping through our run, not returning a call, yelling at your kids, forgetting your debit card at home. We're human. We are not actually designed to be perfect. We have far too much going on to even try to be perfect. Lucky for us, we are not only as good as our last newscast, our last week, our last day or hour. We are not only as good as the last meal we ate, the last conversation we had, or the last deal we signed. We are all more than that. I was able to let this idea of perfectionism go in news anchoring when I went from anchoring a 30-minute show to a 2-hour show. In a 2-hour show, it just seemed that my mistakes didn't stick out as much, and we were able to continue rolling, and I was able to let go of that idea of perfectionism. And that is where number 2 comes in. This is going to be a hard one if you are a perfectionist. Slowly start letting imperfections seep into your life. Before I had kids and was working long and strange hours, things in my home and my car looked perfect. I kept things exactly where they were supposed to go. They were facing the right way. They were the same spot every time. Everything was practically perfect in every way. At one point, I remember getting into my car. It was maybe 16 months old. I looked at the cleanliness of this thing. I actually looked at the glove compartment where one of the signs from the dealership was still hanging. I thought, my car smells new. It looks new. It's perfect. But this is ridiculous. I'm not living in this car. I grabbed the sign and I threw it on the floor of the car. I didn't even try to put it in a nice spot or the trash. I just threw it on the floor. This was kind of the first step for me to let imperfection in my life. Here we are, maybe a decade later. You should see my car today, or you should not see my car today. But my kids have really been the greatest blessing for me in terms of helping me let go of some of my perfectionism, because there is no way I could keep my car as clean as my inner perfectionist tells me it needs to be. Once I had kids, I slowly started letting go of control and perfectionism of different parts of my home, my workspace, etc. I was able to cope a little better as a perfectionist by understanding it all couldn't be perfect all the time. This ultimately allowed me to start expecting less in other parts of my life, like work and parenthood. So how to start this? If you are a perfectionist at work, don't try to stop being a perfectionist at work. Try to add some imperfection somewhere else in your life so that it starts to become a little bit normal. And it is okay not to be perfect all of the time. I think you'll be stronger for it, and I think you will learn a lot by letting some imperfection in your life. If you struggle with perfectionism in wanting a clean house, don't start there. Don't start letting dishes sit out a little bit longer than you want them to. Start somewhere else. Start putting the pens in the middle of your calendar at work. If you struggle with perfectionism and wanting the perfect body, start accepting imperfections in another part of your life so you can get there and have that true love with your own body. If you struggle wanting to be the perfect mom, start by allowing imperfections in something that doesn't really make you upset or trigger the perfectionist part of you. Maybe you don't care about a perfect dinner as much as you care about a perfectly set table. So let things slide a little where you care less. I think this can rewire your brain that perfectionism is not a normal part of life. Third, get a second opinion. I've talked about on the podcast how I have been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. This is kind of like perfectionism on steroids, or really the mind saying something bad will happen when things are not perfect. The most helpful coping strategy I use is asking someone else if my fear is legit. This helps me know if I'm using reason or if I'm being controlled by my OCD brain. You can apply this to perfectionism by asking someone if they think you have set your expectations too high. This really has to be someone you trust. For me, it's my mom, my husband. So you could say, "Hey, Mom, I feel terrible because I didn't start dinner until 7 o'clock and then yelled at my kids because they refused to wash their hands. This is what was going on. This is the pressure I felt like I was under. Do you think my expectations were too high? Am I truly a terrible mom?" Of course, she'll say, "No, those things do not equal a terrible mom." You could say, "Hey, sister, I feel like I'm not worthy because I don't fit into my high school jeans. Is this a legitimate reason to feel this way?" She'll say, No, you're not, sister, because you are a 40-year-old woman and you wore those jeans 25 years ago." You could say, hey, husband, I feel like I am failing at work because when I am trying to anchor a 30-minute newscast perfectly, I have 2 mistakes at least. Am I the worst newscaster in the world? And he'll say, "No, you're not. You can aim for perfection. If you make a couple mistakes, the world will continue to spin." It's kind of like a reality check. The second voice can drown out the one in your head telling you you need to be perfect. Okay, last up, start by giving grace to other people. Perfectionists tend to not only hold themselves to high standards, but others to high standards. If you are really struggling seeing yourself as a human being that matters and is important, start with other people. It is really an easy and good way to realize we're all just human. For one thing, it takes away all of that comparison. Suddenly, we're just finding ourselves offering grace to someone who messed up. Okay, you know what? Before I let you go, one last piece of advice. I know I was going to stop at grace, but I really want to encourage you to stop following people on social media who make you feel terrible. Stop watching programs or listening to things that make you feel terrible. If you have some media choice in your life that holds you to an impossible standard, it's time to let go. And with that, I'm going to let you go. I'm really excited for our next episode. I want to tell you about it. I chatted with my good friend about being an advocate for your child. She is the definition of advocacy. Among the things she's done include rallying an entire community behind her to get a wheelchair-accessible playground built. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And I want to thank you for being here on Happiness and Progress.